Our gospel reading for this first Sunday of Advent comes to us from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, verses 32 to 37. Let me invite you to listen for God's word to us today. But about that day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his slaves in charge, each with his own work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Therefore, keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight, or at cockcrow or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I wonder if any of you recall, I'm sure you do, that wonderful movie that came out 25 years ago now, Apollo 13. Do you remember that film? It tells the story of what was supposed to be NASA's third moon landing, and how, after their ship was crippled en route, the astronauts Fred Hayes, Jack Swigert, and Jim Lovell were barely able to make it back home safely. There's this scene at the end in which the astronauts are about to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. And NASA tells the families and the media that there will be a period of 3 minutes when they won't be able to communicate with the astronauts. It's a dangerous period. Maybe the heat shield is gone and the incoming ship will incinerate. Maybe the parachutes to slow the ship will not work, and instead of landing softly in the ocean, they'll crash land at a deadly speed. NASA says none of this to the families. They just say that if there is silence from the astronauts for 4 minutes, then it's not looking very good. So, of course, in the movie, in that scene at the end, everyone is on edge. The families are glued to their televisions. NASA is listening, waiting to hear the voices of the astronauts. Everyone, in other words, is paying attention to one thing. When will the astronauts return? When will it be? 4 minutes go by, and then another 5 seconds. And then another 5 seconds. I cannot imagine what it would have been like to be those families at that time. Any time now, desperately hoping for good news to come your way. Any time. Do you know what it's like for one thing to grab your attention, to consume it, and to make it your entire focus? In our text from Mark for today, Jesus tells his disciples to pay attention. Beware, keep alert, he says, for you do not know when the time will come. Jesus is speaking here about the advent of God into our lives. That's the one thing the disciples need to keep their eyes peeled on. And in every sermon I've ever preached about this text, I've always treated this text as an admonition for us to pay attention, to keep our eyes peeled as we enter the Advent season for how God is at work in our lives and in the world. And it is that, this text is that, to be sure, but it occurs to me today that these words are not only about paying attention, they're also about fatigue. Keep awake, Jesus says. In fact, he says it twice, as if he knows his disciples are going to get tired, as if he knows how hard it is to keep paying attention to one thing for a long period of time. How appropriate at this time to hear a text about fatigue. Some close friends of ours are dealing with cancer right now. They've been fighting cancer for the better part of the year. The mother of the family recently wrote on Caring Bridge, "We have cancer fatigue. We have COVID fatigue. We have election fatigue. We have virtual learning fatigue. We are fatigued by our fatigue." Right. Do you know anything about this? About being fatigued by your fatigue? This is why I think today's text is more important than ever for our lives right now. Because it not only asks us to pay attention for a brief period of time, like the families of those astronauts when that 4 to 5 minute window was going to make all the difference. This text asks us to pay attention over the long haul. Therefore, keep awake, says Jesus, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight or at cockcrow or at dawn. Jesus is not just talking here about staying up all night. He's talking about the long haul. He's talking about when we start to get tired by whatever is going on in our lives, will we still keep our eyes peeled for God's grace, for God's hope, for God's love to be at work? The writer Fred Buechner once wondered what would happen if God gave a very dramatic event that really grabbed everyone's attention. Suppose, Buechner imagined, that God were to take the great dim river of the Milky Way and brighten it up a little to rearrange all the stars in the sky so that, written out in letters light years tall, God tells the world, "I really exist." What would happen? Well, the initial reaction might be equally dramatic, right? Churches could spill over into football stadiums. Perhaps wars would suddenly stop. Everyone gets their act together. But then, Buechner says, there would be that message in the stars, night after night, week after week, month after month. Every night the sky would proclaim, "I really exist." So what? What difference would it make, not just immediately, but over the long haul? As Buechner goes on to say, what we really need most deeply is not proof that there is a God somewhere, somehow, performing some amazing magic trick that grabs our attention. What we really need is a God who is here with us right now, knee deep, he writes, in the muck and misery and marvel of this world. Friends, this is the good news that Advent brings us. God is coming to be with us in the muck and mire and marvel of this world. God is coming to be with us here and now, whatever here and now means for you. If it means fatigue, God is with you. If it means fear, God will not abandon you. If it means frustration or doubts about your future, God is going to come to you. And God promises to show up for you, for me, for all of us in ways that we do not always expect. Look again, if you will, at the 4 times that Jesus says the master might return. The master of the house might come, he says, in the evening or at midnight or at cockcrow or at dawn. It sounds like Jesus is just rattling off times of day and night, but do you recall where else we hear about those 4 times? In the very next chapter of Mark, the Passion narrative. When Jesus shares the Last Supper with his disciples, what time does he do this? When it was evening, Mark writes. And then they go to Gethsemane, and the disciples cannot stay awake. They keep falling asleep. Why do they keep falling asleep? Because it's midnight, the middle of the night. And then Jesus is arrested, and Peter follows him, and Peter denies knowing him. And what happens after Peter denies Jesus for the third time? The cock crowed. Are you following this? Evening, midnight, cock crow, and then Jesus is taken before Pilate. Do you recall what time Jesus goes before Pilate? As soon as it was morning, Mark writes. Evening, midnight, cock crow, dawn. These are not just random times of day and night that Jesus is talking about in our text. He's talking about the last night of his life. He's talking about his journey to the cross. I think Jesus is saying that if you and I want to find God, if we really want to see God in action, if we really want to pay attention to what God is up to in this season or any season, go find a place where someone is carrying a cross. And don't go as a spectator, go as a participant. A member of one of my former congregations once shared with me a story from his family. Many years ago, one of his sisters died of cancer. She was still in her 40s, and it was, needless to say, a terrible blow to the family. At one point, she was in the hospital being treated for her illness. I can only begin to imagine the fatigue that she must have felt at that time. Fatigue from the treatments, fatigue from always making trips to the hospital, fatigue from wondering what would happen next in her life. She would have had every reason to be tired, to be focused on herself and just getting herself through the next day. Do you know what she decided to do while she was in that hospital room? She wrote a note of thanks. Not a note to her doctors or nurses, although she did make a point to thank them all later. No, on this occasion, she wrote a note of thanks to the chef in the hospital kitchen. She wrote to him, complimenting the chef on the food that he had prepared for her to eat during her hospital stay. Now, how many of you have ever been in the hospital before? Either as a patient because you were staying there or because a loved one of yours was a patient there. How many of you have been in the hospital before? And how many of you have eaten hospital food before? And how many of you, after eating the hospital food, decided, I need to write a note of thanks to the chef today? Right. So it comes as no surprise that this chef was dumbfounded to receive such a note. He went up to her hospital room and told her that in all his years of cooking for a hospital, no one had ever written him a note to say thank you for the food. What are you paying attention to these days? Where are you looking for God to show up in your life and in this world these days? May I suggest that you and I focus our attention on how we can be the most gracious people we can be, just like that former church member's sister was from her hospital room. In the midst of a society that's feeling cranky right now, getting impatient right now, in the midst of a time when any of us can feel overwhelmed, what if we made graciousness the primary focus of our lives? In every encounter, in every interaction, with every person we see and every word we speak, we pay attention to the cross that someone else is carrying and how much grace we might be able to show that person. Because that's what the season of Advent is preparing us for, right? The day when God shows us more grace than we can ever imagine. The day when God's grace is born into this world as a vulnerable child. The time when God's grace came among us, teaching and healing, and then carrying his cross, not just for his people, but for all people. Do you know what it's like to make the grace of God your entire focus, to have that grace capture your attention and make graciousness the point of how you live your life? A number of years ago, Bill Moyers created a documentary film on the hymn Amazing Grace. In the film, there's a scene that takes place at Wembley Stadium in London. This is back in the late 1980s, and a variety of musical groups and artists have gathered at Wembley Stadium to celebrate the 70th birthday of Nelson Mandela. For 12 hours, groups like Dire Straits have blasted the crowd through banks of speakers. They cry for more, the crowd does, and curtain calls take place. It looks to all the participants like everything is building up toward a crazy and chaotic crescendo at the end. What they do not know, what the fans do not know, is that the promoters of the event have scheduled not a rock band, but an opera singer named Jesse Norman to be the closing act. The film cuts back and forth between scenes of the crowd in the stadium and Jesse Norman being interviewed, discussing the hymn Amazing Grace with Moyers. Finally, the time comes for Norman to sing. A single circle of light surrounds her on the stage. She's a majestic woman. She strolls out. There's no backup band. It's just Norman, and the crowd is restless. Alone, a cappella, Jesse Norman begins to sing very slowly. And a remarkable thing happens at Wembley Stadium that night. Thousands of raucous fans fall silent at the sound of a hymn. By the time Norman reaches the second verse, "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved," the soprano has the crowd in the palm of her hand. By the time she reaches the third verse, what do you think the crowd is doing? They're singing along. They're digging far back in nearly lost memories for words of grace that they heard long ago. It is, in fact, one of the things that I miss the most right now. The ability to sing safely in this room with all of you. You know, we'll be able to do it again. I don't know when. It might still be a while, but we will be able to sing safely as a congregation again right here. In the meantime, before we can all sing together in this room, may I remind you that your life can be a song of grace. Your life and my life can be every day a way of showing God's grace is real, a way of showing God's grace is coming, a way of showing God's grace is for everyone. Even when we're tired, our lives can be God's grace for others. Every single day, at any time of day, any time now, we can be the graciousness of God. I'll let you figure out the details from here. Amen.